So when our little son was just a tyke, there's this man in the church, and he was kind of his hero. His name was Kurt, and he was this farmer who had a big farm truck, and he had this great big rambunctious lab. And Kurt would show up at the church to, fix something or whatever, and he'd have his dog in the back of the truck, and for our son, it would be like the carnival was in town, right? Like they'd play fetch, and it was this big deal. Here was Kurt with his truck and his dog. It was the most awesome thing. And one day our son just announced that when he grows up, he said, "I want to be Kurt." And I said, "You mean you want to be like Kurt?" And he said, "No, I want to be Kurt. That dog, that truck." Now, with kids, that kind of truck and dog envy is something that we can smile about. But I think as adults, we do something like that too. And with adults, it's far more dangerous. Now, all summer long, we've been talking about the Ten Commandments. And this is our last in the series on the Ten Commandments. The final commandment, or the final two, depending on how you divide it. It could be two if you think of coveting spouse and coveting house as two separate commandments, as sometimes they're traditionally numbered. Or you can think of it as one, thou shalt not covet. And this commandment is a commandment that, unlike the other ones, is internal. It's about what we desire. And the thing is that desire really gets at the heart of all the commandments, even though most of them have this external element. All the commandments at some level are really about learning to desire rightly. Now, it's true that all the commandments have this internal piece to them, but for the most part, they're externally oriented. They're things you can really see or not see, right? So thou shalt not kill, or commit adultery, or make an idol, or steal. You can tell. It's pretty obvious if someone has done those things or hasn't done those things. Thou shalt honor father and mother. Thou shalt keep the Sabbath. They're external. You can see them. They're pretty obvious. But the final commandment, or these final two commandments, they really get at the heart of it all, literally. Because they are about the disposition of the heart, what we want. It's all about our desires. And you see, for us as followers of Jesus, as Christians, everything is ultimately about desiring Christ above all else. That's the heart of it, desiring Christ. Now, the word here in Hebrew in the Ten Commandments is simply the word for desire. That's the word we translate as covet here. It's desire. It's really a neutral word. It can be a positive desire or negative. So Psalm 19:10, the commands of God are more to be desired than gold. Or it can mean delight in some of the prophets, or pleasant, right? Something desirable, delightful, pleasant. But in the way that it's used here in this commandment, it means covet. To covet is a special kind of desire. It's desiring something that someone else has. It's not just wanting the same thing. It's not just saying, I like that truck, I like that dog, I want one like it. It's saying, I want that exact thing. I want what you have. And coveting even goes a step further. Coveting is really saying, I want what somebody else has, and I want them not to have it, right? It really comes down to envy. And envy is one of the deadly sins. Envy and covetousness flow, or what cause all kinds of other evil thoughts and desires. Envy is what leads to joy in the misfortune of another, or displeasure at their prosperity. Envy is a sense of pride that we have something desirable and, well, somebody else doesn't. Envy and covetousness are very destructive. To covet a neighbor's spouse or house is to wish we had it and they didn't. And so this final of the Ten Commandments, it really sums up all the others, and it brings them down to that heart condition. It's not just about whether we can outwardly keep these commandments, it's about whether our hearts are in the right place. And we've seen that all the way through. Right? Jesus often took the commandments from the Ten Commandments and he pointed them towards that deeper heart level. He highlighted that heart level. It's for Jesus, he says, it's not only don't kill, Jesus says, don't hate. Right? He says it's not only don't bear false witness, he says be completely truthful in everything you do. He says it's not only don't commit adultery, but do not lust. Right? So there's this heart level. And this last commandment is like that. It brings the whole of the Ten Commandments down to the heart. And really, it comes down to desire. And this is why I'm not sure putting the Ten Commandments up on a wall, if that really does the work that we need it to do, if it makes any difference. Because it's not enough to just see the Ten Commandments. It's not enough just to try to keep them. Ultimately, what's going to matter is where our intentions lie. What do we desire? Are we becoming people who desire to worship God with our whole heart, mind, and strength? Are we people who desire not to kill, desire not to commit adultery, desire not to lie, and so on? And you see this all over the Old Testament, right? This desire. Psalm 119, 131, I long for your commandments. Or the desire for God in Psalm 63, oh God, you are my God, I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water. The question is, what do you desire? Now, covetousness and envy are fundamentally desires gone awry. So when our desires are aligned with God, are pointed towards Christ, then we can see someone else experiencing good, and we can rejoice at their good fortune. We can give thanks for a blessing that's come their way. We can thank God for their prosperity, their health, their success, whatever. But if our desires are disturbed or disoriented, then we'll find ourselves stumbling down the wrong path. And you see the tragedy of covetousness and envy written all across the pages of Scripture. So think about when Jacob's wife Rachel saw that her sister Leah had children, but she didn't. It says that her heart was so sick with baby envy that she said to Jacob, give me children or I shall die. Or David is envious. King David, he's envious of Uriah's wife Bathsheba, and he commits adultery and murder and lies to make her his wife. Or Ahab is envious of Naboth's vineyard, and he commits injustice and fraud and robbery and false witness and murder to get that. Or in Romans chapter 1, Paul says that humankind without God is full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, craftiness. Or Galatians, the work of the flesh, the opposite of the fruit of the Spirit, includes envy. Or 1 Peter 2, 1, rid yourselves therefore of all malice, guile, insincerity, envy, and all slander. I mean, it's just as bad as it sounds. And I think this is why Jesus speaks in his parable in Luke chapter 14 about the cost of discipleship. And this is why he uses so powerful language to speak about how we're to desire him above all else. And if you've got your scriptures open, we're going to just look at that a little bit in Luke chapter 14. But Jesus speaks about desiring him above all else. And in verse 26, in 14:26, Jesus says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, his wife and children, his brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. He says hate. Now, that packs a punch, right? That is powerful language. It's not literal language. Sometimes Jesus speaks in this way to really draw us in and help us understand what he's getting at, the heart of what he's getting at. It's not literal hate. But I think what Jesus is saying here is that if we don't love him above even all of our other most precious commitments, our love for mom and dad, our love for our kids and brothers and sisters, our love for our own life, if we don't have a love for him that is above all of those things, we will not be able to follow him wholeheartedly. And in Matthew, that's the way Jesus says it. Whoever loves father and mother, son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And there he's making clear it's about loving him above all else. It's about prioritizing our commitment to him, our relationship to him. It's about putting our desires in order. Now, this is part of what he means when in verse 27 he says, anyone who does not carry his cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. It's about having our desires ordered to that cruciform way of life. It's about taking on this uniquely Jesus-shaped kind of life. It's this total life reorientation. Count well the cost. Understand what you're getting into. That's what Jesus says. Now, of course, he's being a little bit facetious when he says that. I mean, what cost really compares to the surpassing greatness of knowing him, right? What good is it to have the whole world but lose your soul? I mean, where else can we go? He is the one who has the words of eternal life. And as he says in another parable, if anybody finds a treasure in a field, they'll sell everything they have and go buy that field so they can get the treasure. So, he's convinced that the cost is worth it. And I think his disciples are too, because his disciples said, Lord, we've given up everything to follow you. In the scheme of things, the cost is minimal, but there is a cost. In verse 33, in the same way, any of you who does not give up everything, he cannot be my disciple. Now, this is the thing. For Jesus, it's not just about coveting. It's about completely revising our relationship to people and stuff. So we have to be detached from riches. We have to be detached from the desire to become rich. There is no way to thread our soul through the eye of the needle and enter the kingdom without that detachment. We have to be ready, like Paul, to count all that we have and all that we are as loss compared with knowing Christ. And at the very least, this means that day to day we will see our possessions, our very life, as belonging to God. We'll seek to put our resources at God's disposal. We'll ask, how can I serve God with my stuff? How can I serve God with my whole life? Now, I always like stories of people like St. Francis of Assisi. This famous figure in Christian history, St. Francis. He gives up wealth and privilege. He comes from this wealthy Italian family, gives it all up, and goes out on the road to follow Jesus wholeheartedly with this kind of lightness of spirit. Or, the apostles who say, Lord, we've given up everything and followed you. And that's part of what this means. But I think it also means doing the sort of thing that you see organizations like MEDA, the Mennonite Economic Development Associates. You see MEDA doing some things like this. It's where they're an organization that's led by successful business people, often wealthy business people, who devote their business acumen toward improving people's lives in developing countries. And part of what they do is make investments, right? And that's exactly what it sounds like. They make investments. They expect a return on their investments. They put down money in companies and ventures. They have a man who goes and who travels to Africa, to Asia, to different continents, and looks into the books of the companies that they're planning on investing in, and they do their due diligence. It's kind of a hard-nosed approach, but yet at the same time, they're going out on a limb, right? They're asking, how can we use our resources, not just our money, but also our business knowledge? How can we use these resources for the service of the kingdom, for building up people's lives for good? I think that's another way to do it. And so I think about giving up everything to become Jesus' disciple. I think this is going to mean learning to have a tremendous humility. We recognize that we're not owed anything. We don't deserve anything. Whatever accomplishments we have, they're always going to trace back to God's good blessings at work in our lives. Whatever success we've experienced comes because God has granted us intelligence or a good work ethic or health or a supportive family. And so our attitude will be one of gratitude for what God has given us, coupled with a tremendous sense of humility. As King David put it in 1 Chronicles, he goes in before God and he prays and he says, God, who am I and what is my house that you have brought me thus far? We're called not to covet, but above all, we're called to desire Christ. You see, the problem with coveting, with envy, it's not just that it's bad. It's not just that we're breaking God's rule. Coveting really flows from pride, from this disordered sense of who we are. Coveting is a matter for the heart. And the reason the 10 Commandments end on coveting is because when we covet, we're making the heart sick. So think about it. When someone is envious, when someone is coveting, we talk about them being green with envy, right? Green with envy. It's the color of being sick. They're the color green. They're not red with envy or yellow with envy. They're green. It's like when you eat a bacon cheeseburger and ride a roller coaster, you turn green. That is what happens when you covet. You turn green, right? It makes the heart sick. And so you see, these 10 Commandments are about life. They are about being truly alive, not living a life that is sick at heart, that is desiring something else, but about being truly alive, becoming who God created us to be, walking before the Lord in the land of the living, the 10 Commandments, listen to this, they school us in authentic human life. It is impossible to be truly alive and be filled with envy. Now, envy is not always just keeping up with the Joneses. It's not saying, I want that dog, I want that truck. Envy is also manifest in this kind of underlying discontent, this sense that we deserve more, we deserve better. We're smarter, we're more attractive, we're harder working, we're better at whatever than they are. And so we ought to have such and such a thing. We ought to have that house. We should have that spouse. And envy and covetousness often come out of this desire, this naked desire for the truck or the dog or whatever they've got next door. But it also gets transformed into this kind of hostility towards the people next door. Why do they have it and I don't? There's one more thing. Envy and covetousness aren't just manifest toward the people next door. Subtly, powerfully, envy really is a kind of hostility towards God. You see, when we covet something that someone else has, there's this deep down suspicion that God hasn't given us a fair shake, that God hasn't treated us right, hasn't given us what we deserve. And there's this suspicion that somehow God has not lived up to his end of the bargain. And we're subtly calling into question God's loving kindness, God's justice, God's character. So I think what Jesus is getting at in Luke 14, when he says that we got to take up our cross and follow him, is that we got to crucify all of those assumptions and claims and beliefs about what we think we're owed. And I think what Jesus is getting at when he says that we have to give up everything and follow him is that we've got to shed all of our false assumptions about our lives and identities, and we've got to come totally transparent before God. We've got to give it all up and come naked before God. Part of this means learning to desire rightly. Envy and covetousness are misplaced desire. They're desiring the wrong thing or desiring the right thing, but in the wrong way. And so there's a way in which following Jesus is learning to desire aright. Following Jesus is about desiring the one thing that is needful and then pursuing that with all of our hearts. Now think about it. Most of us are not motivated by rules. Right? Rules aren't what get us up in the morning. I mean, I'm firstborn. I'm sort of a rules follower. But most of us are not motivated by wanting to follow the rules. Most of us are motivated by desire. We want something. We want an income or a car or true love. And so we go looking for those things. We order our lives to achieve what we want. And we may choose to follow the rules along the way, but following the rules comes in the course of seeking out something that we desire. We don't start with rules, we start with desire. And I think it's the question, that should come up for us is the one that Jesus put to Bartimaeus, blind and begging on the side of the road. You know, Jesus didn't heal Bartimaeus right away in the Gospels. He comes up to Bartimaeus and he says, "What do you want me to do for you? What do you want?" That's his question. And I think sometimes that's the first question that Jesus puts to us in the course of our lives. What do you want? It's Psalm 20, verse 4. May God grant your heart's desire and fulfill all your prayers, right? May God grant your heart's desire and fulfill all your plans. I mean, that's a prayer right there. May God grant your heart's desire. But the question really is, what do we desire? What do we want? And can those desires and wants be schooled in the way of God? Now, the 10 Commandments are really about desire. The 10 Commandments start by orienting us towards God. They start off saying, "I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me." And then the 10 Commandments wrap up at this place of the human heart and human desire. Because you see, we will do what we want. We will pursue our desires. We will order our lives around some goal, even if that goal is just comfort. And it strikes me that so much about following Jesus comes down to desiring him above all else, right? Because We can tie ourselves in knots trying to figure out the will of God, but I think that sometimes the question of the will, what is the will of God, it's almost too open-ended. It's just too big for us. It's greater than we can contemplate. What's the will of God? I think sometimes the question really has to be, what do you want? And if we've learned to order our desires toward Christ, toward his ends, toward his ways, then we will start to want the same things that he wants, or at least close enough. I want new people to hear the gospel. I want people to connect to the love of Christ and to his church. It's not because Jesus commanded the church and the disciples to go out and preach the gospel. It's not because he laid down a rule. It's because I want it. I want my life to count for something. And I believe that following Jesus takes me in the right direction. I want families to thrive. I want to see the church grow. I want these things. And so then I order my whole life to achieve them. It's not because of some rule. And I think all of us are like that. We will pursue what we want, what we desire. And we're called to desire Christ above all else. Now, desire for Christ is going to be the only desire that is fully worthy of us. It's the only desire that's worthy of a human lifetime. All of our other desires can be folded into our desire for Christ. Our work, our possessions, our family relationships, the place we choose to live. There's a way in which desiring Christ will unfold and give deeper meaning to all of those other aspects of our lives. And sometimes too, I think there can be underlying desires that Christ is using to call us to him. Sometimes God will use that magnetic pull of his heart to draw us to him. And there'll be some longing within us, something that we so deeply desire that can be made holy, that can draw us to the love of God, that can catalyze this deep desire to see the face of God. And I'm sure you've had some things like this in your life. I have. One of those things, one thing leads to another, and you realize that there was some desire that God had been pulling you along in. One of those was learning Spanish. To be honest, I chose Spanish when I was a freshman in high school. I chose Spanish because someone told me, wrongly, that it was going to be easier than the other languages that they had on offer. That I can confirm that is not true. But once I got that idea of learning Spanish, it became this desire for me, something I really wanted. It was like this core motivator in my life. And at some point along the way, someone's like, do you want to be a missionary or something? And I'm like, no. And I guess at least sometimes I have kind of been a missionary. But God used that desire to learn Spanish to draw me into this much broader and deeper set of desires and goals for the building up of the church, for connecting cross-culturally. And that underlying desire was something that God used to draw me through to him. And I think it's like that for all of us. I think there can be things in our life that we desire that can reveal themselves as a desire for God. And it's true that not everything we desire is good. Some desires can threaten to take us down the wrong path. And probably most of those desires, even those, the ones that are not so good, if they were rinsed in holiness and prayer, even those would point us towards the God in whom we live and move and have our being. But I think that maybe the question, or maybe one of the questions we have to be asking ourselves is this: what is your heart's desire? What are you longing for? And are there ways that what you desire leads you through to a desire for Christ? I'll tell you a story or an example. Writer Madeleine L'Engle, her books were books that I read as a kid, and now there's that movie, A Wrinkle in Time, right? But writer Madeleine L'Engle, she talks about when she was a child, she spent a lot of time reading. She was a voracious reader, and she had this passion for reading. And reading fiction in particular helped her to survive boarding school, which was a really difficult time for her. And she writes that the books she read, including the scriptures, and she was a person of deep Christian faith, she writes that the books she read nourished, and she says this, they nourished a hunger in me, the hunger for the truth that is beyond fact, the hunger for courage and hope in a difficult world, the hunger for something more than ordinary vision. L'Engle's hunger, her passion for reading, led her through to a desire for truth, which led her through to a desire for the one who is the way, the truth, and the life, for Christian faith. So what's your desire? What is your passion? How is Christ drawing you to him through that passion? How is he schooling you in desiring him above all else? Perhaps one of the great tragedies of covetousness is that it's longing for what others have and then subsequently failing to see what we have in our own lives, in our own moments, in the place where we stand. It's failing to recognize that we don't need to look at what someone else has because we have been deeply blessed. We have been loved beyond measure by the God whose love is boundless. It's this God who came in Jesus Christ. It's this God who has called us to himself and who has given us everything we need to love and live abundantly. Brothers and sisters, this is the word of the Lord. How will you live by this word? Amen.